Slides. Give me 1 minute. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Nigel Brown, VP of Professional and Managed Services here for Microserve. And really excited to be here today. I really appreciate you joining. Today's session is all. Let me test my clicker, see if this is going to work for me. Today's session is all about Surface Modern Workshop. So really appreciate you all coming out. I'm happy to be here. Essentially what this is a Microsoft sponsored session. So you see a lot of the slide content is theirs. I can't claim fame to all the fancy graphics and animation, but then I apply sort of my own spin to the presentation. That said, for any of you that do want to dive a little bit deeper, happy to do a follow-up session. And I'd also suggest I've kept enough time in the slides that I'm not going to bore you to the slides for an entire hour. So feel free and chime in if you got a question or comment to add. Feel free and jump to do that. Maybe I'll ask Sil and Julietta to monitor the meeting chat while I'm going through. And if there's any questions, then feel free to interrupt me so we can address it right then and there. So with that, my slides going here. So in terms of what to expect, here's a quick kind of roadmap of our session today. We're going to look at Surface and the modern workplace, at a higher level, and then dig more into the meat of it around modern management and zero-touch deployment through Microsoft Autopilot. We'll then wrap with a quick summary of Surface portfolio devices. I've got oodles of slides that if you want to go into speeds and feeds and specs, we've got those too, but I'm not going to bore you through all that unless there's a specific need for it. So with that, let's dive in. So, as we look ahead at each of our organizations, most of us, if not all of us, are now faced with the reality of some form of a hybrid work. When we think back to the beginning of the pandemic, so many of us were forced into adapting and adopting to new ways of working. Many of us undergoing one of the most rapid digital transformations we've ever seen, certainly myself included. In other cases, maybe we couldn't react quite as fast enough as we would have liked or implemented the exact tool sets we would have wanted. And we really figured out how to do things and get past the pandemic and remote work through bubblegum and Band-Aid solutions as a way to get by. But as we look ahead, with staff returning to the office again, and I'm sure many of your staff have begun to return to work, or if not, probably in the not too distant future, what we can also expect is that some of those staff are likely to remain working from home at least some of the time. And this is really what enters our new era of hybrid work. So the question then becomes, how do we ensure that everyone, regardless of whether they're at home or at the office, is in equal footing, as far as their technological footprint? How are we able to interact and collaborate with our colleagues, no matter where they're located, whether they're at home, at the office, at an airport, at a coffee shop? And that's sort of the theme around how this all ties together. Surface products themselves are really just one piece of that puzzle, but a part of that broader M365 modern workplace solution in the story. You really don't have to have Microsoft hardware to have a lot of that great experience, in regards to much of what I'm going to talk about today in terms of how we manage devices, how we deploy devices. But even given from my own personal experience, living through it firsthand, I had switched to a Surface a few months before pandemic hit. So I can give you kind of a true testament, though, to the actual product of the Surface device, how it helped my experience, and I'll talk about that in a little while as well. So if we think of why Surface tied to that, the story of Surface, and I got to hear this down in Redmond a number of years ago, and back then I couldn't care less. It was like, why is Microsoft getting into the hardware business? But it really was exactly that. A few years ago, Surface was a pretty new endeavor for Microsoft. They weren't ever really in the hardware game before then. And Microsoft, why they did it was, as they pitched it to me, was they wanted to do something differently. And to do that, they needed to have ownership, not just the software experience side of the story, but also the hardware experience side as well. And the reasoning behind this was that they really wanted to put at the forefront doing things like bringing natural interaction to the PC experience. So this means not only just using the keyboard and mouse that we have since the dawn of personal computing, but using touch to do things like pinch and zoom and scroll, for example, that we got pretty used to on iPads and other devices, but we didn't have in the Windows experience. And when you combine that, bringing in a pen to this environment to be able to write in your own handwriting to take notes, for example, was pulling together that hardware and software and the blend of both worlds. So essentially to provide the promise of that natural interaction experience, Microsoft needed ownership of the entire ecosystem. So they did that. They built out the department of what they called human data, focusing on elements of hardware design that we'd think of, industrial design teams, but also fashion design, emotional design, all of these other elements. Some really cool things that, if you ever had the chance to go to Redmond and go through some of the tours on this, going to the quietest room on earth, it's in the Guinness Book of World Records. That's how they test devices, and they understand the noise that comes off a Surface device and how that can interact or affect a meeting experience, for example. So really essentially trying to put people at the center of everything that they created and that they designed from both hardware and software perspective. Really essentially paying attention to those details that matter the most to provide what they would want to dub as a premium experience. Now, whether it is Microsoft hardware or other OEMs, in my opinion, organizations do need to invest in a modern device strategy that does help enable, create better and more efficient workplaces, for example. For end users, really it comes down to that flexible work environment that empowers those that rely on the technology, but also for those who manage it, who many of you might be on the call today. Now, from a recent survey done by Microsoft or one of their third parties, the feedback from end users using the Surface hardware does seem to reason that using Surface devices can enable a more collaborative work environment. As I mentioned earlier, I happened to switch to a Surface Pro to try it out a few months before the pandemic hit. And it really, ironically ended up being the perfect time to have that device. The things that I didn't really expect to floor me, I was worried about the kickstand and doing some of these other elements to it, getting used to that. What really drove home for me was the quality of the built-in mic, the cameras, technology that was built into it. And I'd have to say, in the first time in 25 years of working in this industry, it's the first time I wasn't plugging peripherals into my machine to actually have a quality audio visual experience. So when I was on meetings, it was the camera built into the laptop, the mic built into the laptop. Since the start of the pandemic, I sit on my back porch when it's nice out. I wander to my office. I'm moving all through the house, not plugging anything in, which for me really did drive home that I think some of the stats you see on that slide are true. So Surface devices combined with that broader M365 ecosystem are really what deliver real value to organizations to help move the needle in a number of priority areas, largely what you see on the screen today. So I'm not going to go through all of these today, but the ones I'm really going to focus on is touching around productivity or extending the dialogue we're already having around that, and then simpler IT process. And those are the big ones I picked to drive home with you folks today. Largely with productivity, I've kind of touched on some of the key points from my personal experience with it. But, I think the key theme here in terms of the device hardware from Microsoft is the concept of that premium device. As in a great example to this, the pen experience alone, in my opinion, is different than any other touch-enabled device. I've personally been using some form of a tablet touchscreen on a Windows device since maybe 2005, 2006 was the very first Lenovo device form factor that I used to use back in the day. My left bicep still bigger from lugging the thing around, taking my notes on it because I wanted to live on a pen. The Surface of that first device, another thing I didn't expect was the feel that they give you on that, using the pen on the screen. So apparently they've actually tried to recreate the feel of ballpoint pen on paper. So there's actually a tactile, emotional feel when you write on it that's a lot more like recreating the writing on paper experience. And then more than that, they actually created the screen layout designed to emulate a sheet of paper. So when you flip your device over to read a Word document, you've got that feel of I can mark up a Word document, add notations and edits to it, and it has the feel of holding a sheet of paper in front of you, just like we did in high school, right? So, when you combine Surface with the Teams element, talking about the quality around microphone and camera, for example, or even extending that into collaboration using things like Microsoft Whiteboard, then that's really where tying it back to the pen in terms of the device hardware really does enable a better collaboration experience. There's a number of other points here in more detail that I'm going to talk to, but certainly I could agree with that in my experience in the past 2.5 years. Now, Windows 11, in my opinion, really, it's just the next generation of the operating system that we all love or love to hate, that mandates a layer of security that it never did before. So it's not a drastic shift from Windows 10, in my opinion, and then the start menu turned to the middle of your taskbar, not off on the left side, funny little things like that. The menu layout's different. But in my opinion, really all it did was force our hand in terms of the security elements of what we should have been applying to devices when we were deploying Windows 10, or for that matter, Windows 7 back in the day. But many organizations didn't either have the time to implement, didn't have the technical, capability to make sure that we deployed some of those functions. Windows 11 has just really changed the game because they're now mandating, TPM enabled, some of the security settings that should have already been there in the first place. So then we get into a little bit deeper conversation around simpler process, for example. The topic near and dear to my heart, given a lot of my background and career, has been around endpoint management specifically, is about how we do our jobs from an IT management perspective with those desktops. So if we can reduce the complexity and the cost of device management, we can take our teams and we can start shifting them towards focusing on critical tasks, project work that's focused on enabling the business to achieve more, whatever that more might look like depending on your organization. Essentially we do that, again, not just because of the hardware that we're talking about today, but because we're leveraging the power of Microsoft Endpoint Manager to manage all those devices, whether they're at the home or in the office. When we go to a Surface device perspective specifically, then we can get into doing things like bolting on advanced exchange as a premium service. And that ensures that you can actually get a replacement device before you ship back a defective unit to Microsoft, for example. So really where the rubber meets the road, though, is it's all about shifting us to the world of modern device management. And obviously this depends on where you're coming from in your background. Maybe you're an on-premise SCCM shop, maybe leveraging Altiris or third-party tools, or maybe no tools at all for that matter, and trying to elevate our game here. There's never been a better time to consider it if you haven't gone down this journey already. So what is it? Endpoint Manager is essentially that combination of Microsoft Intune, integrated or co-managed with Config Manager if it is required for the on-premise side, and then potentially integrating with third-party tools, which not everybody thinks about. But a number one integration that I'd see would be something like Jamf for managing your Mac fleet, integrated with your Endpoint Manager solution, for example. So you get some of the wins from a security perspective from Endpoint Manager and Microsoft's conditional access, while still taking advantage of some of the power that Mac imaging has under a product like Jamf, for example. So the blend of both worlds can be a part of this as well. So, really the power comes from the fact that we're making that shift to cloud-based management and cloud-based ways of working overall. Essentially devices no longer need to connect to that on-premise Active Directory environment, where historically that's been where all of the security policies, settings, and applications will come down, is from some server on-premise or from Active Directory group policy, for example. And really what we're doing is shifting this all under Microsoft Intune, under MEM instead. Taking this a step further, and my advice to any of you on the call that hasn't started really sort of modernizing the endpoint management side and are still on-prem domain joining machines, consider not even on-prem domain joining anymore, or what's called hybrid domain join. More and more organizations are realizing the power that if we go Azure AD native join, where it's not connected to the on-prem Active Directory anymore, we've got all the same security settings we could be applying at an endpoint manager as we did before, but none of that legacy chaos of having to have connectivity on premise. So that's really where the better client experience comes from. The higher level of security comes from, is the fact that it doesn't matter where the device is anymore. It doesn't have to be on our network. Now, getting over that hurdle, though, there are still some gotchas. The number one that we see consistently as we're running modernization projects for endpoint management is around Wi-Fi. It's one of those things where it's still using device level authentication, deploying a certificate to the device, for example, and so that it can join your staff or your corporate Wi-Fi. There's solutions around that, but that's some of the intricacy to look at. I would say do that as a part of your project, though, and try and get to that state. You don't need to on-prem domain join as you migrate. Most apps can still work. Accessing Windows file share still works without being domain joined. So there's almost no reason you have to anymore other than things that require device level authentication. Now, while we do these projects, one of the big benefits to our endpoint management teams is that we stop spending all this time doing the simple and mundane tasks, doing stuff around creating and maintaining images. And instead, we start spending our time diving into things like endpoint analytics and reporting data that really enable us to start looking at ways to get proactive and focusing on end user experience. This screenshot and this one, by the way, is actually Microserve's live data for our fleet of probably close to 600 endpoints right now. And the scores we're achieving, but we're watching this very regularly, trying to optimize the application reliability, improving the overall Microserve employee experience. Now, where modern management can even go one step further is the fact that we can start taking advantage of cloud-based or remote BIOS management, all done natively under Intune. As you can see here from the little video playing, using DFCI or device firmware configuration interface, which, by the way, is only available for Surface products. Other OEMs can take advantage, but nobody has yet. This means we can actually control the hardware and the firmware on the device, right down to doing things like disabling boot off the network or USB network boot or USB boot, or right down to disabling the camera, which I think is in the video. And you can do this all centrally. No need to build in or bolt on third-party software. So on a Surface device, you get this one level deeper where I can literally get granular and turning off and controlling BIOS settings all remotely, which means then, of course, when we get into zero touch, we can deploy it through that method as well. Now, let me pause there before I kind of switch gears a little bit. Does anyone have any questions or comments before I keep going?
What I find interesting, Nigel, is that a lot of this applies to most of the customers' fleets, whether it's desktop, laptops, or tablets, devices in their environment.
Yeah, you're right. It really doesn't matter what it is, and again, it doesn't have to be Surface hardware, just because that's the driver behind today's workshop. But yeah, a lot of the value is achieved on any endpoint that we're looking at managing. And better than that, it even ties down to your mobile phones, iOS, Android devices. A lot of the policies, some of the stuff we're looking at deploying, same tools can potentially do that. And again, reducing complexity, management of a separate MDM tool versus your desktop management. That's why they started calling it unified endpoint management, was one unified tool to do it all, right? Okay. So if we dig a little bit more, this is a pretty good quote. It comes from some customer in Denmark, if I recall, and is not too far off base to the reality that we've seen as well. I did this yesterday testing, thinking maybe I'd give it a shot to do live, and it just turns out it might take me a little bit too long because my user profile has about 45 apps that deploy as a part of Autopilot, and I couldn't make you sit here through that whole process. But a very simple user environment. If you're deploying Windows, Office, maybe a couple custom apps, and all the security and policy settings, it really can be a 10-minute process to deploy a new machine if we get this set up right. So if we draw back though to the traditional Windows deployment methodology, first off, we pretty much always had to get our hands on the physical device. And then we take that device and we build our custom image. Maybe we got a little bit smarter and we looked at using SCCM or MDT or other solutions, where drivers were separate from that, and we can inject hardware model drivers into one image. But either way, you still built an image, you still deployed your settings, your apps, configuration, policy, all that stuff to your device, and you basically then took a snapshot of it. We've been doing the same thing in IT for 25, 30 years. And then once we have that image, then we're going to deploy it, often through USB, through Ethernet, or some other method potentially, but those are the most common that we'd see. And then you do it again and again and again. And for large organizations, by the thousand, we spend all our time just getting an image onto a machine. Why? Because we need settings and policies applying to it to make sure it's secure, to make sure it has the apps that we need. None of this really provides the value to the end user. They don't care how it got there, just that when they log in, they have what they need to do their job. Right. Oh, sorry, and Siri's coming on my watch. Now, if we switch gears and think about zero touch in modern management, we convert that legacy way of thinking from autopilot, or sorry, from imaging to building an autopilot deployment profile. You can see the list below that, though, is essentially the same. Why we're doing it? Because we need to control what settings apply to a device, policies, Office and apps. Broader than that, for example, inside of Microserve, we aligned to the Windows 10 benchmark policy from CIS as a template. So every machine that we roll out through Autopilot is aligned 100% to the CIS Windows 10 benchmark from a security standpoint. So you can build that all through a device that never touched my hands, never touched IT's hands in any way, got delivered to the end user, and it's just as secure as when we used to image it. So then essentially we just deploy devices without having to touch them. And I'll talk to some caveats to that in a minute. And then when we do, we get a whole lot more free time. Of course, it's Microsoft, so they said play Xbox instead, but you get the idea. Essentially, we're freeing up our time and our resourcing from doing some of the mundane tasks and moving to a modern way to do it. So if we look at end user lifecycle of a device, in this case, talking about Surface, but really, honestly, this is the same no matter what OEM that we're talking about. So it starts with obviously the decision. We're moving to modern management. We're going to change how we deploy devices. We're going to do that through Autopilot. So essentially, of course, Microserve would be here to help you through building that tailored solution for here's how I image today. Here's what I need in a machine. How can we do this under modern management tool sets? Helping you get set up for that foundation. Now from there, essentially, we order the device. Again, that can be through Microserve. The key here is that when you do that, you're going to request to make sure that you're getting hardware IDs from, in this case, Microsoft as a part of your order. As long as you get that, either they can do it direct or we can, or you as an end user can then import all of those hardware IDs of the devices you purchased into the Intune console in advance. So that's really the prerequisite behind the pretty slides here, is making sure that hardware ID that's unique to every single device gets enrolled into your specific Intune tenant. When that happens, where the magic really starts coming into it, but also maybe a little bit more of the complexity in the back end, is using Azure AD and Intune to essentially look at creating a methodology to get that dream state of role-based deployment happening. Some of you might already be there, leveraging SCCM and things like that. Think of this as the next level of that, where we're doing this, achieving the same thing, but not through a custom image by department or SCCM roles or things like that, for example. Instead, essentially, we're using Azure AD native groups, configuring separate deployment profiles potentially, and then building out, if you're sales and you're SIL or on sales team, maybe he's got unique apps that he needs that us in IT or HR don't, and vice versa. So we build out those personas, how they get deployed. And once that magic has really happened, that's when that order of the machine, the user gets it from that great Amazon delivery or whatever the box is as it arrives to your house. And then when they go to log in for the first time, we identify right away they're in a sales role, and all of the policy, apps, and settings are going to apply directly to that device. And of course, that's it. You're basically, the user's ready to go. It never touched the hands of IT on the way there. So again, that required that prereq step of configuring this right to see it through. Now, we switch gears to, again, this is about lifecycle, so it's not just provisioning it, forgetting. The idea being, okay, this Anna lady that we just deployed decides to leave Contoso, the wonderful Microsoft demo company. So when they do decide to do that, we don't need to bring it back to Microserve IT or to the IT department to re-image a machine anymore. You can initiate an autopilot reset, which essentially restores it back to that original factory state. And then the device, if it's still good, it's still a working machine on warranty or whatnot, then we can re-provision that device for the next user. In this case, Raul, who's in IT, takes that device, signs in for the first time, and that exact same autopilot process applies, but this time for a different user persona, deploying different apps, maybe different security policy settings, for example. And then lastly, when the device has really reached its end of life hardware, through that autopilot reset process, you can deprovision it and make sure it gets recycled or donation or whatever your decommissioning process might be. So this kind of just summarizes that all in a nutshell into one single slide. If there's a good takeaway from today, I would say focus on this. It's not so much about lifecycle of Surface, it's lifecycle of any device that's being deployed and managed through modern methodology. And it kind of gives a nice, in a summary, wrap shell or nutshell to it. The key here that I'd really focus on would be the magic and the investment you got to do is how you design Autopilot to function to give that experience. So it's not just your vanilla image that needs all these apps manually installed after the fact. Package all your apps under Endpoint Manager. Have them assigned to specific groups to target your user base, and that's really what will start enabling that end-to-end experience. Now, of course, to see the end user experience, if those of you haven't seen it before, this is going to kick off. This is essentially, imagine you got shipped a new machine from Microserve tomorrow, that hardware ID got enrolled, and that's it. So this is your unboxed first power on that you're going to see word for word, right down to, okay, first thing I got to do is connect it to my home network or whoever's network I'm sitting on today. And then very quickly, you're going to see when it comes back up after the network's connected, it phones home, and right away it knows that I'm Christy Klein. Welcome to Contoso. For us, it's welcome to Microserve. It knows that it's my assigned device. And this screen is essentially the old school imaging. It's transforming that device to be the end state of the image that we've spent so long trying to build images for and deploy out to your fleet of devices. Give it a sec here, but you'll see basically essentially first time logon. This has been condensed, I'll give you that. On the last screen, my machine, I've got about, what did I say, 46 applications that deploy as a part of Autopilot provisioning for my role. Some of those being scripts and policy settings, for example, that we've customized with. So this can take some time, which will be a lead into what I'm going to show you in a second. But the end result being nobody needed to touch a machine. Up comes Windows. More than that, you're going to see me open up or see this user open their personal files app on OneDrive. And assuming you've moved your personal data or home directories into Microsoft OneDrive, for example, under the M365 umbrella, it takes no time for that user to be back up and running on their new machine. So that's the experience. If you haven't seen it, an Autopilot device end to end, this is what the user gets to experience. So it's not only a win for my team, because once this is set up, I'm not building a new image for the next whatever. I'm just updating Autopilot profiles and policies and updating the apps that get deployed to user groups, for example. Now, this also going to apply because another common scenario is you need ways to get it when there isn't a device that's tied to a direct user. So you can look at self-deploying or kiosk mode as a means to still achieve some of that same value in the shared device scenario or kiosk modes or things like that, for example. Now, I did talk about my scenario. I got a whole lot of apps. Now, if I'm going to re-roll my machine or get a new machine, do I as an end user want to sit there and wait for all of those apps to be deployed? So same thing, it was easy. I can self-service and I can get my machine up and running. The key to remember is if you're a heavier imaged machine, it still takes a little bit of time at that configuration step. It's essentially doing what we did in imaging. So when you start looking at this at a larger scale for any larger organizations, or you're looking at a large scale refresh, for example, that's really where the value of what we call white glove pre-provisioning comes into play. And think of this just like if you leverage Microserve today and our tech centers to pre-stage and image machines in advance. Essentially, this still can apply and still have a whole lot of value under an Autopilot world, because that means we've pre-staged the machines. In this case, Anna's Autopilot profile is already deployed on the device. We did that centrally in our tech center. Obviously, you're on IT teams, you can do the same thing. And that speeds up the process for the end user. Because what we don't want to do is they put down the machine, they log in, and then it takes 2 hours for them to wait for provisioning to happen. Because we pre-provisioned in advance, then right away when we hand that new machine to her, she logs in, the apps are there, everything else is there, and it really cuts down that time to redeploy the machine or to get the machine deployed. So when we look at the tech experience, it looks really, really similar to what it did under the end user experience. What we're going to see here, basically all we have to do is the first time you power on a new device, you hit the start button 5 times when you hit that very first out-of-box setup screen. Walks you through the same little wizard, but in here, as you saw, you go into pre-provisioning mode, and then you see the same setting up your device for work, all of those policies, all of those apps coming down, getting applied to the machine. But at the end of the process, it looks different. As opposed to logging in for the first time as an end user, you're going to get this little green screen that'll pop up in just a minute here that essentially says, deployment complete, device has been pre-provisioned and ready to go. And the last screen will essentially be a green screen to tell you that, that allows you to reseal it. So there you go. You can see the end state. It's green. If it's red, it's bad, by the way. So something broke during your deployment process. End state is green. If it's our tech centers doing this is the screen they're looking for. They hit the reseal button, and that's it. The machine powers itself off. We don't log into it ever again. And when it gets to deliver to the user, all those apps are preloaded. Config, security settings, and policies have all been applied down to that device. Any questions there before I keep going?
Nigel, maybe a point, for the audience here. I talk to a lot of customers around this program, and one of the questions I get often is how do I migrate? And maybe you can talk to this at a high level. How do I migrate relative to my current investment that I've made and in my current imaging process with SCCM and the way we operate today? What is the transition, kind of a high level roadmap to go from where we are right now under SCCM to this new way of doing imaging and provisioning?
It's a really good question. I agree. That's probably the top question to just how do I get there? It's not as monolithic as it sounds, but it really depends on the organization and how far into your journey are you. Assuming maybe you've already got M365 deployed and Exchange and Teams online, for example, hopefully you're at the point you've also migrated things like home drives into OneDrive. Maybe those are all advanced projects you do before you tackle this, or maybe it's a parallel project. However you spin that, like to me, those would be some of the prereqs that really make the magic happen on a deployment side. But as you get a little bit more technical, and I'm going to try not to go too deep technical, essentially, really the number one step is enabling co-management with your SCCM or your config manager server on-prem. Essentially, you're going to do tenant attach. You're going to cloud connect it so that now config manager knows about Intune and Intune knows about config manager. When that happens, if your imaging devices in the old world, they're still going to Azure AD join. They're still going to show up in the Intune console. You could right away, without doing anything else, you start getting advantage of endpoint analytics, for example. So endpoint analytics is there. I can start looking at, app performance and issues, reliability scores, some of the other value right out of the gates. Your hardest piece in the whole puzzle, in my opinion, are kind of two things. If you're heavy group policy from security policy and settings on your device, well, you need to migrate those out and transition them under Intune. And that can take some time. A lot of it, we've got 25 years of legacy group policies all the way back to Windows 98 days, through to, Win 7 or Win 10 on-prem. So we need to do a serious eval of, do we need them? Why are they there? Do a migration, which has gotten easier now, into Intune. Once policies and settings are there and configured how we want, then basically all your time is spent transitioning apps. Now you can still live, if you're a config manager shop, your apps can still come down from SCCM, assuming you've got a methodology to have that cloud connected. So it depends on network connectivity, for example. If you're inside of your customer network or your own network environment, then yeah, you can still autopilot a machine, but the apps are provisioning through SCCM until such time as essentially you transition out those apps into Intune and away from SCCM. But it also depends on your end state, because Microsoft still totally supports the world of, that's why they called it MEM and they didn't just call it Intune, is the fact you can run both forever if it makes sense to. And some larger scale app deploys might still make sense to live in Config Manager, but move the bulk of your image type apps under MEM and Autopilot, for example. So it's a bit of a journey, and it depends how big you are and how many apps you have and how invested you are, right? But high level, to me, there's a couple simple steps that start the process. and the rest is all just, environment dependent.
Yeah, and we have a question in the chat, but I like the fact that you said that it's kind of a journey, and Microserve can help walk customers through that journey. So the question in the chat that we have is, with options like DFCI being specific to surfaces, does Intune automatically recognize the surfaces we have in the environment and give them those options, or it is something we need to set up on our side and just add the new devices in that pool?
That's a really good question. So
These were
because
two meaty questions.
they are and
Yeah.
deep technical, here I am trying to stay higher level. DFCI, the number one thing to remember, it's designed to support any OEM, not just Microsoft. Microsoft just happens to be the one that adopted it so far. So essentially, it is under Intune. If you're familiar with the console, it's under configuration profiles. If you hit new configuration profile, same as that little demo video that applied, you'll actually see nowhere does it say when you go, I'm going to create a config profile for DFCI, that it says Surface or Microsoft devices only. You're configuring a DFCI profile that theoretically could apply to any OEM that supports it. So policy-wise, you're configuring the config profile, you're making sure it targets the machines you want it to target. And if it supports DFCI, then that config profile is going to apply. It could cause you, if it's deployed to machines that don't support it, maybe device compliance errors, for example, are showing it as non-compliant. So you'd still look at your fleet and target the right devices. There's a lot of different ways you can do that. Let's see, where's that? And give those options. Yeah, so essentially those options are there. Now, I will show you in another minute. I'm going to switch gears and talk about the Surface Management Portal built on MEM. And then, yeah, that's detecting all your Microsoft Surface hardware. All your Microsoft devices show up in that portal. But it's unique to this because there's no real portal that you're looking at DFCI and what devices applied to it. That config profile applies like any other config profile onto those machines. So hopefully that helps answer that, Mike. Okay, that I will keep going. So obviously, Microsoft is really pushing the fact their signature image is designed to be auto-piloted. Again, because the firmware can be managed through DFCI, you're really getting into sort of firmware defense. It's been in the past, 5-6 years, the whole topic of firmware security has become a really big deal. And to do this with other OEMs today, that is quite frankly where it's still pretty painful. You still need some of their tooling to look at ways to deploy config settings and policies or firmware updates. And that's one piece that doesn't matter if you're modern management or traditional, is still just a pain in the butt to do. In terms of what we need there, quickly touching on licensing, I don't want to turn this into a big licensing dialogue, but essentially what's really required, you need Azure AD, at least premium P1 licensing, and you need MDM tools. So this is specific to Autopilot I'm talking about here, but Autopilot does not require Intune. There are other third-party MDM solutions that can leverage Autopilot. Of course, I wouldn't necessarily recommend going down this path unless you get a good reason to. To me, the Microsoft tooling is more than adequate for most scenarios. So really the number one way clients would get there, if they're traditional Office 365, like where you have an O365 E3 license, for example, you're going to look at bolting on enterprise mobility and security licensing on top. So that's one way to get there. Maybe the broader way to get there, depending on your needs. If you want things like Windows Analytics, well, that only comes in Windows 10 Enterprise. So then you move from the O365 license stack with EMS, and you switch to M365 licensing. So if anybody's ever wondered why O365 versus M365, that's the big shift, is essentially M365 gives me my EMS licenses, my O365 stack that it's always given me, and it also gives me Win10 Enterprise, all rolled under kind of one licensing umbrella. So I'll switch on again, a little bit tied to more of the Microsoft specific stuff. Is one thing that they released maybe only about a year ago, is the Surface Management Portal. So again, natively integrated into the Microsoft Endpoint Manager console. But But essentially, the driver I see behind it, I've used other third-party tools, still do in some of our managed service accounts, for example, where we're trying to get one pane of glass to get visibility of the fleet, visibility of warranty status and end dates, for example, all that type of data. So really the value is that if you're on Surface hardware and you're using modern management, you really are reducing the cost. You don't need some other tool to validate warranty end dates, to get some warranty hardware support, for example, that's sort of built into the tool chest. Tool chest wise, that's just a high level what the console looks like. If you're familiar with Microsoft, looks pretty darn similar. I can get an overview of all the devices and the different models and makes that you can see listed here. And then of course, you can get to the all devices screen. You can get some high level stats and details about all devices. Now back to Mike's question before, this is where it is auto detecting. So if you have 2 surfaces in your entire fleet and you've got them in tune enrolled, they will show up here. You didn't have to do anything fancy to make them pop up. It recognizes Surface hardware and puts them into this pane of glass. So probably to me, the number one benefit behind this, other than it's cool to just do a report on your hardware fleet, is the fact that we can get to that warranty data in a useful manner. And this is exactly what I've deployed third-party tools within clients or for our managed services customers to get that same visibility no matter what their fleet is. So it's nice to have that built into one place, if you ask me. And of course, engaging into Surface support, if you're doing things like advanced exchange, having that as your means to log your tickets, get access all through one pane of glass is a great way to be able to do it. Of course, in terms of wrapping, I couldn't be here without Microsoft unless we're talking about the portfolio of hardware. And this is pretty much the summary slide. I'm not going to go any deeper than this. Some of you might be familiar with it. You can look at the Go options if you want the small device unit form factor. The Go 3, I'm excited to get my hands on. I had the Go 1, I had the Go 2. It's actually the device for me that replaced my iPad at home. It's my home entertainment machine. I still check email and run Teams on it and the odd meeting off of it too, which is kind of cool. But sort of the smaller end units. And then you get into either the tablet convertible device form factor, the Pro 7 Plus now, Pro 8 or Pro X, depending on form factor you want. Or you switch gears, like my wife, for example, cannot stand the kickstand and never got past it. So she loves the Laptop 4, though, for example. So it gives you a more traditional feel, that form factor that many people know and love. But this reminds me of the device kind of like when the iPad Air, the Apple, what was it called? I forgot what it was called. The beautiful, thin Apple device came out. This reminds me exactly like that. It has the same hard metallic feel. It's got a really, just nice experience on it. And then you get into the cool special options like Laptop Studio. I'd love to get my hands on. I haven't seen that yet. The Duo is really cool to have a dual screen phone. Duo 2, especially now, it's fixed some of the elements in the first iteration it had. And then you get into the really cool ones, the Surface Studio, more like your workstation, big digital display, beautiful. You can write on it, but it's your workstation essentially at your desk. Or into the collab space is the Hub 2S, in 55 or 85 inch options, but that really gives you that power of a collaborative device in a collab workspace. When we think hybrid work, to me, best way to do this, take a Surface Hub, do coordinated meeting join with the Teams room, like a traditional more boardroom setup. And when you set up coordinated join, right, you don't have any mic or speaker conflicts, but you can sit there and collaborate on a digital whiteboard that goes forever. We've been using it more and more in our office, and it's great for those remote. They can still see the whiteboard. If they're on a touch-enabled device, they're participating and writing on the whiteboard at the same time, tied back to the device as well. So that's the portfolio in a nutshell from a hardware perspective. Again, we can share out these slides after, but what Microsoft did was kind of design them for user personas or roles. What type of device fits under what user persona category, different options for different solutions, right? So this helps maybe custom tailor what type of hardware should I put in at different devices or for different end user personas. As you can see in the matrix here, I'm not going to read those all to you. But yeah, you can see where maybe the studio goes into designers, engineers, researchers. They're more targeted device, not something you're going to deploy every day. But as you get into laptop models, yeah, again, information workers, the broader audience, they can be a phenomenal device as well. And so with that, really appreciate everybody taking some time today. We can create modern solutions with or without the Microsoft component or the Surface component. A lot of what I talked about today is really kind of hardware agnostic with some bells and whistles that really Surface helps bring to bear, though.